Our first speaker is Agnes Mangarich, a flight nurse and the author of Albanian Escape, true story of a U.S. Army nurse behind enemy lines. She hiked with her comrades 800 miles in 62 days after a crash landing in German-occupied Albania. Mrs. Mangarich and company trudged through rocky terrain 6 to 8 hours a day with little food until they reached a British and American camp on the Adriatic coast. Mrs. Mangarich.
When they said war without mercy, I didn't realize there was a war with mercy. However, I did have the opportunity or the misfortune to land with in a plane that went down behind enemy lines. And where were we? In German-occupied Albania. And those people knew mercy, and they'd been shown very little in their time. And they took us in. If they hadn't taken us in every night, we wouldn't have made it, because this was November and December and the first week in January. And I was in there for about 9 weeks. What little food they had, which was very, very little, they shared with us. And they knew the horrors of war, but they also knew to be of a gentler kind. And they just by taking us in at night saved our lives, because that was bitter winter weather. And when we did get to the coast, there was a boat waiting for us. It was our U.S. works with the OSS, and they had a boat waiting for us to jump aboard and make our way back over to Italy. But who helped them? Who helped the Albanians afterward? I didn't see much help. They were walked over by Greece and Italy and Turkey all their lives and been oppressed. And did anyone help them rebuild after they blew the bridges and all these to make it very easy to chase the Germans? I didn't see any sign of it when I went back in '95. But they still thought we were the greatest people and showed us every courtesy and kindness. And I had my son and my daughter with me. They'd heard about this story for years, and they were very happy to meet the Albanians. In fact, they wanted to stay another week, but we didn't have the time. They were being shown such a good time, and the Albanians, for the first time in their lives, were able to be up in that one little section of Tirana, their capital. Because the Germans, their own people, as a matter of fact, their terrible, terrible dictator they had for 50 years thereafter, kept them very, very much curtailed and told them where they'd be, what they could wear, how they could behave and stay out of these areas. And they had nice villas they'd had built along the seashore, the Adriatic shore, just for their own entertainment and their henchmen, the people that were on their side and took good care of them. They were well taken care of, but everybody else could live on cornmeal bread and very little of anything else, as we found out. But after our 800-mile trek across Albania, which was we were helped by the British, who were in there. They'd parachuted in and been in there several weeks, working behind the lines, and they knew, of course, that they would have to. They'd move about very often because just to stay out of the way of the Germans. But they also helped us, and with the one leader, a young British lieutenant, he was 22 years old, and there were more than that. 10 of us nurses, and nurses are always at least 21, 22 years old before they get their training and out and working. So here was young Gary Duffy. He was 22 years old, and he was younger than any one of us. And we used to laugh at him at times. We knew he was worried. He had all this responsibility of seeing that we went across the country safely and got out. And he'd sit on, and lots of times the radio wouldn't work. He couldn't make contact with Cairo, his headquarters. He'd be sitting on a stump or a stone, and we scratching his head, and we knew he was worried. And so we'd kind of walk up behind him and whisper in his ear. We'd say, "You can tell us, Gary, we're older than you are." And he didn't appreciate that either. But he was a very, very good leader. His word was law, and we knew it. But he used it very well and very gracefully. And I'm sure when he retired to a place near Liverpool in England and enjoyed a nice retirement. I had hoped to see him again someday, but I understood he had died in a parachute into Berlin, which was erroneous. So when we were in England some years later, I didn't even try to call him. And so there I missed a chance to see him again and tell him how much we appreciated and, in fact, owed him our lives in many cases. If they had worked in any other place, I don't know where they would have found somebody as loyal as he was. In fact, the people who lived in retirement with him said he never talked about all his great exploits, all during the war, which he had gone in a very young man, 39, and he'd already seen 4 years' service before he ever met up with us in Albania. But he was still right at it and went back. But even then, I don't believe he had leave. When we got out, I think they just gave him another assignment, and there he was, back in the thick of it. And this seemed to be typical of what they call the SAS, and we call the OSS. And they worked behind the lines at all times, and kept track of the enemy and their antics, and kept us in a safe, straight path. I was glad I got out of there. I was glad I did it. But I wouldn't want to do it all over again for anything. Not even for a camera, I don't believe. Am I off the air or not?
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much, ma'am. Our second speaker is Captain James Carrington, United States Marine Corps, who was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for extraordinary heroism in action in the Philippines from March 1944 to February 1945. Captain Carrington escaped from Bilibid prison in Manila and established contact with the East Central Luzon Guerrilla Army Forces. He trained non-English speaking guerrilla recruits and formed them into an able combat team which successfully faced the enemy time and time again under his command. Sir, the floor is yours.
Well, I'm going to speak about the brutality of the war, being in Japanese POW for the least amount of violation of low discipline. The Japanese had every power in the world just to take you and beat you and behead it. And also they had you in 10-man groups. One escaped, they shot the other 9. So I had to bid my time. I was a prisoner for about 23 months till I could be in a place where they didn't have us in the 10-man groups, because this prison was Bilibid right in the heart of Manila. And so they didn't have us in 10-man groups because they thought with all the electronic stuff all over, it was an old Spanish prison with a 14-inch wall. And so I decided to escape with another Marine. Well, they were having a propaganda film, and we went around, they were all watching the movie, even some of the sentries. And I went first in this weak spot under this wire. And Parker, my buddy, followed me and he hit the wire. And he set off an alarm. They had a riot in the prison and all. And So then I was picked up by a carretella, that's a little horse and wagon, and I was taken to in front of Santo Tomas where they had the civilian. And this fellow was Calesa, pony he was driving. It's like a two-wheel wagon with a little horse. He took me to his house and hid me. Then he contacted the guerrillas, but I wanted to get with a guerrilla that had an American leader, because a lot of the Filipino, led by Filipino guerrillas, they were robbing the natives. Their carabaos, their chickens, their rice, and everything. And so I joined up with Colonel Ramsey, Edwin P. Ramsey, East Central Luzon guerrillas. That's in the Manila area. And so he sent 15 guerrillas down to guide me out to the mountain. I think it was only about 90 miles on the west side of Manila, his headquarters in the Sierra Madre Mountain. So we had to swim rivers because the Japanese on the bridge, and the Filipinos knew all the trails to take you the back way. None of that Hollywood stuff, you're running down the street, you're doing this and doing that. You had to depend upon these Filipinos. And Filipinos anyway were about 90% pro-American. So they took me up to the headquarters in the Sierra Madre Mountain, and Ramsey swore me in the guerrillas I was a corporal in the Marines, and he swore me that. And I ended up being a captain with the Army and a corporal in the Marines at the same time. So my job was to protect that headquarters at all costs. And so he made me the commandant of the headquarters, and I trained about 200 or 300 guerrillas like Marines train you. I trained under Chester Pull in 1940-41 in Shanghai when he was just a major, executive officer, 2nd Battalion, the 4th Regiment. So in the guerrilla forces up there, my job was to protect that headquarters at all costs. So we controlled 25 or 30 square miles. And so when any strangers come in there, Filipinos, we kidnap them and made sure they had a relative in that area. They weren't Japanese informers. Japs used to tattoo their men on the head, their spy, and let the hair grow out. So I think his name, General Barber was the head of the Jap intelligence. So, and if we found out they were informers, what we did, we turned them over to the Badogo. He's a butcher. And he'd take a big bolo wrapped around his wrist and hold him by the head, and he'd hit him, cut the head off that way, show the head this way, so he wouldn't get no blood on him. And they said his eyes were red, The other Filipinos were scared of him. So then we were having trouble with the communist guerrillas. They're called the Hucks. Huck Balahapwa Hopun, I think, is the army of the people against the Japanese. Well, we were fighting over these barrios, you see. So we sent these liaison officers to join up with the Hucks to try to make a peace with them so we can both turn on the Japs at the same time. But what they did when our men leaned their rifles against the trees and stuff, they jumped out and bushed our men with bolos. So for retaliation, one evening, my guerrilla band captured 15 Hucks. So we buried them alive. They cut their heads off, some of them, and the other ones, were still living and tied their hands behind their back. And they were still talking under 4 foot of mud as retaliation for what they did our man. So then the Hucks were fighting the Japanese and fighting us, and it was foolish for us to use our ammo on each other, so we decided to quit fighting each other. So then it came to Manila. We had MMD, Manila Military District. Our man in Manila was in charge of liquidating all the informers and pro-Jap. I think we must have killed about 200 a week. And also up in the mountains there, I had the Japanese tried to take the headquarters. And I was on a mountain called Benetwanan, and they had another mountain called Balagbag. And I had the high ground. So the Japanese attacked it. I think it was around in December 44. And I held the Japanese off for about 8 days so we could prepare to go down to the lowland. And so what I did was, on the second mountain, Balagbag, was the where we had all the big shots, the VIPs, doctors, lawyers, high-class Castilians, Spaniards, the Archbishop of Manila, and Ramsey, the whole high-ranking different guerrillas. But if the Japanese would have got through me, they'd have massacred that whole bunch. So I was one lone Marine with about 8 men and 2 machine guns, and I held them for 8 days until we could prepare to go down to the lowland, because Americans had landed, and also we swept down out the mountain, and the Japanese were retreating up in the mountain. I don't know, I think they call that kotai switchy flopping. And their tanks and all were on the road. We had to wait until they were spread out a little and run between them and lay in the ditch on the other side. And went through their lines, and then we swooped down on Make Hawaiian, Polo Abando, and we captured those towns before the 37 Buckeye Division come down the highway. It was just they had what they call a point, then a bigger unit, a platoon, then a company. So what happens is, there's a little red-headed looking guy, and me, I was dressed in a Japanese coveralls and a pair of Jap officer's boots and an old campaign hat. And he says to me, "You look like an American to me." I say, "Sure. I've been here for 3 years waiting for you guys." And he said, "I think you got any Marines with you?" "No, Mike Arthur don't want those Marines around. He wants all the glory." So I moved into Manila with them. So I started fighting the 7th of December. And then that's 1941. 1942, prisoner of war, 43. And 44 is a guerrilla. And so I helped capture Manila February the 3rd, 1945. I moved into Manila with the 1st Cavalry Division and the 37th Buckeye Division from Ohio. And I thank you. I was a terrorist.
Thank you, sir. Our third speaker is Captain Joachim Wedekind, a young merchant mariner when the German government ordered all commercial vessels to join the military effort. He was one of 660 survivors from the incredible story of the Steuben, an event recently featured in National Geographic magazine and the Times-Picayune. After the war, Captain Wedekind launched a career as a marine investigator on behalf of ships and insurance companies, sorting out accidents and assessing damage to cargo. Sir, I'm afraid I have to give you only 10 minutes to tell your incredible story. Sir.
I'm not a speaker, so I don't have prepared too much in the sense of holding a speech. If you allow me, I will use the National Geographic issue of February 2005 because I worked with the editors to write that article. And the way this came about is I'm regularly on websites reading the German magazines, Spiegel. And one day I look at the headline and it said the wreck of the Steuben was found in the Baltic Sea. Now that for me was something that I hadn't thought about for many years, in fact about 60 years when it happened. And I contacted the Polish Navy in Washington and told them that I'm probably one of the last survivors. So they contacted their office in Gdynia in Poland. Now we talk the Baltic Sea now. The eastern part of the Baltic Sea was East Prussia. And the Russian troops came in from the east and run all over the Baltic and the Baltic states and East Prussia. And they had been known to be very brutal. They run over everything, and I'm just reading part of the story here in the National Geographic. Men and children had been clubbed to death, shot or run over with tanks. When Germans later on retook the village, this is one particular village in East Prussia, they invited reporters from neutral countries, Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain, to see what the Red Army had done. Now, what happened there was these troops were particularly brutal. They were Mongolian-type troops, and they were very much trained on just kill everything they encounter, regardless of women or children, because there were mostly women and children in the farms. The husbands and sons were all soldiers, and many of them had died in the Russian theater. So all these people now tried to get away from East Prussia. And a decision was made by the German Admiral Dönitz to get everything that floats, all ships, fishing boats, everything that floated, and get people to the west to save them from the Russians. And it turned out to be more than 1,100 ships involved. It was the so-called Operation Hannibal. Now, it was very difficult to get all these people on board ships that were normal freighters with cargo hatches, and a freighter usually doesn't take passengers. We had to crowd thousands of people in a hatch and a hold of a ship. Now, I talk about young children, babies. Some of them, in fact, were born on the ships during that time. And it was very cold. It was 20, 30 below zero. And all of these people had fled their homesteads with everything they had, which was usually on a cart with a horse and they took their goats along and whatever they had. And then they arrived after days of going through the snow and ice at the port of Pillau or Danzig. These are all ports in the eastern part of Prussia. And we started to bring them to the west to make it as short as possible, because this was a long and difficult operation. We transported 2.3 million people with ships to the west in 4 months. So everybody, now this was done against Hitler's orders. Dönitz took that on himself, and we were empowered to do something that hadn't been done before, and a dictatorship is very difficult to understand. The people who kept this from happening were the so-called brown shirts, the politicians, who wanted to hold on whatever they had and whatever they had been done, like mayor of a city and the governor of a state, and especially the governor of East Prussia, who I saw on another ship, on the Wilhelm Gustloff, getting all his furniture on board, which prevented us from getting people on board. So what we did is we dumped it all on the other side. He didn't see that. Now, to tell you what the situation was, I have never, as a merchant marine officer or crew member, wore any arms, because you were just civilian. At that time, the Navy gave me a gun in order to be able to work with these ships and get these people on board without interruption. And the problem was that in between were people, not only of course, I forgot to say wounded soldiers. Most of them were wounded soldiers. And in order to get them on board, it was a very fluent situation, which was interrupted at times by secret police and by the politicians. And so what we did in many occasions was we just got them off the ship forcibly. And of course, all this was against Hitler's wishes. And so we had quite a lot of problems there, but we solved them. And we got all these people out, and out of 2.3 million, I think the total of people killed on ships were, somewhere around 30,000. Because there were other ships, such as the Wilhelm Gustloff, that sunk before ours, with 8,000 people on board, and the Goya had 6,600 on board. All of them perished. On the Stäuben, it was not my ship. I went on board in Pillau in order to reach my ship, which had sailed from Königsberg, of which I was a commander. But I asked the captain on the Stäuben if he would mind if I go along with him to reach my ship a day later in further west. And he said, of course. So I went to sleep, and for 3 days I didn't have any sleep or anything. So I went into the cabin of the second in command on the ship, who, by the way, I met years later here in New Orleans, and fell asleep. And all of a sudden he comes into the cabin and he says, listen, you better get out, the ship is sinking, we got a torpedo. I was so sound asleep, I didn't know what went on. And I looked at him, I said, you're kidding. So this was ship number 6 I had lost during the war, so I was used to it. But and then came the second torpedo, and then I knew it was serious. So to make it as short as possible, I went to the bridge. The ship sunk in 18 minutes, and out of 5,200, we survived 600. And it happened pretty fast, and it was ice in the water, it was very cold. And I was swimming from the bridge to a capsized lifeboat and lost conscience. And then a minesweeper got me off and put me in the engine room and got me into about, I think, a quarter of a bottle of rum, and that saved me. So that's what happened on the Stäuben. But it is a long story, which is very well written here in the National Geographic. So.
I would certainly encourage people who are interested in this story to find that issue from the National Geographic. It's an incredible story with some fantastic photographs in there. Our fourth and final speaker today is Dr. Lester Tenney, Staff Sergeant and survivor of the Bataan Death March. He spent 3.5 years as a prisoner of war in Japan, including time as a slave laborer in Japan, then went on to receive his PhD in finance and become a professor of finance at Arizona State University. Sir?
Thank you. Good afternoon, friends. After being here for 4 days, I think I can call you friends now. I have a choice, and that is because of the time constraint, either I can speak real fast or try to condense what I have to say. Because the Japanese knocked out all my teeth, I can't talk real fast, so I'm just going to condense some what I might say. All during my time in captivity, I realized that I can't choose how or when I'm going to die, but I can choose how I was going to live. Friends need friends. And lastly, I kept my faith in my country, which I love dearly, and faith in my God. And lastly, I am forever thankful for the friends that would not let me die. Speaking of friends and of this program that's supposed to deal with war with mercy, I agree. It reminded me of a few things that I must share with you. And I'll try to define it in 5 different ways. Number 1, on the Bataan Death March, the first day or 2, I was beaten severely. I had my teeth knocked out, my head split open. On the 4th day, a Japanese soldier came by trying to cut heads off. He missed my neck, but he hit me across the back and down the back. My 2 boyfriends, Branji and Sugoi, would not let me fall, because on the death march, if you fell, you died. If you stopped marching, you died. There was no question about it. They carried me. They would not let me fall. War with mercy. They kept me walking. If you've ever believed in the hereafter or here in God and the great being out there, we marched. He brought the medics up from the rear line. They sewed me up with needle and thread, and they carried me. I begged them to let me go, but they wouldn't. I don't know why, folks. I have no idea why, but 5 minutes later, the Japanese pushed us to the side of the road and made us rest. In the middle of the day, the first time in 4 days, they made us rest. There was a stream of water. Branji and Sugoi threw me in the stream of water. It was cold. It shook me. 10 minutes later, the march started, and I was on the march. I never needed help again. I don't know why, but I know that Branji and Sugoi most probably saved my life. And the hardest part was coming home and saying hello to Walty, Branji and Sugoi's mother, and having to say they didn't live to come home. That was hard. The second thing I share with you is that we went on work details in camp. When we went on work details, the Japanese gave every man a number. And you see, they were trying to protect the men from escaping and becoming a guerrilla. Every man had a number on these work details. If you did not answer roll call one morning or one night, they took the 5 men to the left and the 5 men to the right and killed them. And the purpose of that was to protect that you didn't escape. In other words, it got to the point that we were thinking of others rather than thinking of ourselves. And so that's another way that the war with mercy occurred on the death march for us. Then we went to Japan. And in Japan, we had a Captain Tom Hewlett, a medical doctor. Tom is not around today to be able to share anything with us, but I'll never in my life forget the Japanese were insisting that out of every barracks of 50, 48 must go to work. And Tom Hewlett was a doctor. And one day the Japanese officers came to him and bawled him out because one barracks only had 47 men to go to work, and they insisted that he take one of the 3 men that was sick and make him go to work. And Tom Hewlett said, no, these men belong in a hospital and I cannot make them go to work. They threatened Tom Hewlett with the guardhouse. Tom Hewlett put his hands up and he said, take me there. I will not send these men to work. They put Tom in the guardhouse. Tom Hewlett was in the guardhouse for 10 days. He came out at the end of the 10 days, and the Japanese officer stood in front of him and said, and now will you send the men to work when I tell you to? And Dr. Tom Hewlett said, no. If they're too sick to go to work, I will not send them. Flabbergasted, the Japanese officers had to back down. But that was war with mercy, as I've ever seen it. I remember Tom Hewlett performing operations, a hemorrhoid operation, with no anesthesia, nothing but a little cooking stove and a hot iron, with 2 men holding the men's legs over them as he took this hot iron and worked it in the right position. I saw Tom build racks to put men who had broken backs on the rack. I had my back broken in prison camp in the coal mine. Tom made a rack and insisted that I lay on this rack and I not move for 1 week. Tom did everything he could for the men. Tom was a real, real hero. And then I remember at the end of the war, you know, we always said that the war would be over when 4 things happened. Number 1, if we didn't have to go to work. Number 2, if we ever got all the rice we wanted. Number 3, if we ever got a Red Cross box. And number 4, if we didn't have to bow to the Japanese guard in camp when we saw them. Well, on August 15th, the men went to work. And 1 hour later, they came back. And we said, my God, what happened? The first time in 3 years, no work. At 10 o'clock in the morning, they put us all in the mess hall, and they gave every man a Red Cross box. And by the way, I have to stop for a moment, because when I tell this story to some of the other young students, they say to me, what in the hell is a Red Cross box? Well, a Red Cross box was something that the Red Cross gave, and it was a little box, and it had coffee, a chocolate bar, a little pack of cigarettes, some toothpaste, a few other little personal items. We never had one of those. And so on this particular day, the 15th of August at 10 o'clock in the morning, we were all given a Red Cross box. We looked at each other, 2 out of 4, not bad. At noon, we went into the mess hall. The cook said to us as we walked through, would you like more rice? Why, God, we knew it was 3 out of 4. We only had 1 more left. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, my boyfriend said to me, hey, 10 Spot, you speak enough Japanese. Go out and say hello without bowing. See what happens. I said, okay. And I went out. And I looked at the Japanese guard and I said, Konnichiwa Tomodachi do. And I stood there, but I did not bow. And he stood there at attention and then bowed to me. And I knew the war was over. That night at roll call, the Japanese officers came in and said, America and Japan are now friends. And away they went. And they left all of us in this camp at 4:30 in the afternoon. Well, many of us went into town. We went looking for the guards who would beat us. When we couldn't find the guards that would beat us, we found some lovely girls and some sake. Thank you very much.
What a way to end. We have about 5 minutes or so for questions. There are a couple of microphones set up. Questions? Any questions? Thoughts?
For Dr. Tenney. A few years ago, a guy named Hampton Sides wrote the book Ghost Soldiers, that the movie was based on the Great Raid. According to him, the Bataan Death March and the brutality of it was not a premeditated thing. They just had no provisions, no supplies for such a large number of prisoners. Your thoughts on that? Have you heard about that, studied that over the years? What do you know about that?
Is that addressed to me? Number one, the history will show that the Japanese had no idea that they were getting that many prisoners. We had 12,000 Americans and about 42,000 Filipinos. The Japanese had no idea that we were that many. Number two, the Japanese had no idea that we were sick. Out of the 12,000 Americans, about 8,000 of them had bullet wounds, malaria, and dysentery. So it was a real bad situation that they had not planned on. Number two, they had to get the men out of the Bataan area so that they could fire shells onto Corregidor. That was the main purpose of doing it. There was no purpose and no reason for killing the men on the march. None.
During the last year of the war, I was privileged to teach in a school in Quantico, and among our students were officers who had either escaped or, after the war was over, who were then sent back there to go to school, and so I got to know most of them who came through. Many of them told us that in their prison camps, days before the end of the war, the guards began to soften up and change their attitudes and give all sorts of indications that they understood that the war was about to end unfavorably for them. Did any of your experience confirm that or not?
Well, mine at that time of the war ended, I can only tell you this, on August 6th, I believe it was, August 6th or August 8th, in the coal mines, all of a sudden the workers, the civilians in the coal mines, were talking, and we found out, because I spoke enough Japanese, I found out that there was a big raid somewhere in Tokyo, and there were a lot of people killed. That did not stop them from beating us. The next 2 or 3 days in camp, the Japanese guards still were the same. They did not change. The actual treatment did not change until August 15th. And I understand that was when the emperor gave his message verbally that he wanted the war to end. Thank you.
Dr. Tenney, could you give us a follow-up on a lawsuit that the American POWs had filed against the Japanese company that had made y'all work in these mines?
Yes, in the interest of time, I can follow that up quickly. It's dead. The lawsuit, I filed a lawsuit August 13th of 1999 against Mitsui, not against Japan. I have no fight against Japan. I was a soldier. I have to put up with whatever happened. But I was not expected to work in a coal mine underground 12 hours a day without food or water or without any medical care. And so in August of 1999, I filed a lawsuit against Mitsui. The Japanese had only one witness that came to court for them. The United States State Department became the witness for the Japanese. They claimed that the treaty solved all issues, and they erroneously stated that the treaty solved it, when in fact Article 26 of the treaty was a specific article that stated that if Japan should make a treaty with any other nation that is better than the treaty they made with us, then those parts that are better must apply to us. And Japan made 12 other treaties after the war, after our treaty, that were better than ours. And so that's all we were fighting for, but we had no choice against the State Department, so the case right now is dead.
This is for Captain Wiedekind. You mentioned the failures and the sinkings of the ships evacuating East Prussia. Could you talk about the successes of the evacuation from East Prussia and getting people out of Russian hands?
You mean how many ships were damaged or something?
No, how many people were saved? We know that many people died in the Baltic Sea.
It depended on which ship it was.
Yes.
In our case, we had 5,200 on board, and 600 got away. The Wilhelm Gustloff, if I remember well, had 9,000 on board, and I think about 600 were left. And then another ship also, she lost 6,000 on board, and almost all of them went down. So it depended on, but the overall, if I remember well, it was about 200, let me see, about 40,000 total who had lost their lives on the ships. Yeah. Oh, saved. Out of, let me see, a total of 2.3 million people we brought to the West in 4 months. Only that amount died, maybe 50,000.
I want to thank our
So
speakers.
the rest was saved.
I want to thank our speakers for such a great panel. Thank the D-Day Museum once again for putting on this fantastic conference. One last round of applause for our speakers.